Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Magnetic Masculinity Podcast, where we provide men with practical tools and strategies to bridge the gap between achievement and fulfillment so that they can live their most magnetic lives. Today, we are talking about a topic that I don't think many men want to talk about. Even I don't want to really talk about it or address it, but I think it's really valuable. And in my experience, it has been really valuable to even understand it, which is shame. So there's a lot of things that I wanted us to walk through in this episode. And maybe we can start with identifying what is shame, how does it look like, and what's an impact that shame can have on men.
Well, first of all, if you're listening to this, I celebrate your bravery. Shame can be, I love to look at shame. I find shame fascinating and exciting because I know that shame, or the parts of us that are shame, are like the gateways, portals, or catalysts for our growth, transformation, and up-leveling. But I acknowledge that it can be uncomfortable for people, and I would just welcome you to, or invite you to consider making that discomfort mean that you're getting to the good stuff, and it will be worth it, I promise you. So what is shame? In previous episodes, we've talked about the fact that love and belonging is the number one biological, neurological, scientifically inarguable need of the human species. Loneliness is the absence of it. That's why it's the most excruciating, painful experience on earth. It's literally the absence of our number one need. Shame is the barrier between them. So shame is a distortion because it's never true, but it's a belief that we are bad or wrong, or parts of us are bad or wrong, or unworthy, or not good enough. And not from an energy of like, woo, this is fun. I know I'm kind of an obnoxious jerk in this area or that area. Now I know, yay, now I know what I get to work on. This will be exciting. I'm so proud of myself, but more from a place of, oh, I'm not good enough. I'm fundamentally flawed. I'm broken. I'm not enough. I have my self-worth and my acceptance and my love and belonging is conditional on being perfect or being rich or being this or being that. And anything outside of that is bad or wrong. So it's looking at ourselves as I am bad or wrong, or a part of me is bad or wrong based on whatever would have gotten us approval in childhood, or what we would have had a perceived push away from emotionally. And then what happens in childhood is we look at sort of parts of ourselves that we think are bad or wrong, and we condemn them to the subconscious, and we become inauthentic. And that love and belonging I talked about that we're seeking in our external environment, which is valid. We are a dependent species. We are a socially interdependent species. So there's nothing wrong with that. We do need other people. There's no shame in that. But I would propose that in my experience, the love and belonging first needs to exist within the parts of ourselves. So not creating that internal separation of this part of me is good and this part of me is bad. And if this part of me is bad, it's out of here. We either condemn it to the subconscious. That's where you walk around seeing people that you're like, that's the pot calling the kettle black. If you see people being like, oh, that person's they talk too much, or they interrupt, or they this, or they that, they're such a gossip, and they're like, that is so bad. Chances are that, and you think, what are you talking about? That's exactly what you're like. Or you're like, people are like, my father was such a so-and-so, and you think, well, you're such a so-and-so, but we become blind to those things, whatever we deem as bad or wrong. Or, so we either become blind to it and go around projecting it onto everybody else and having blind spots and not being self-aware of our own maladaptive coping mechanisms or less adorable behaviors and coping mechanisms, or we internalize it and constantly beat ourselves up and sort of become our own internal abuser, where we're like, you're so stupid, you're so fat, you're too this, you're too that, whatever it is. instead of looking at, say, let's use an example of experiencing extra weight, instead of looking like you're so fat, you're so gross, nobody's going to love you. It would look more on the light side of that. It would look more like, whew, food addictions are really tough. I love myself and I'm worthy of love. I'm an expression of love and I'm awesome. So what action steps can I take to help my body look its most awesome? Because I take care of my body and my body takes care of me, and we're both worthy of being loved. And it'd be really fun to look my best. That's sort of like a different flavor. So we can look at the difference even between shame and guilt. So shame would be, I am bad or wrong. And guilt is, I did something suboptimal. I did something bad or wrong. And that's a healthy thing to look at, to be a more socially accountable species, but without shame collapsing. So say, for instance, you have a child who does something like, I don't know, punches a kid at school. And if they come home and you say, you're a bad boy, or you are so bad, you are in so much trouble, you are this, you are that, that's very different than, I love you. You're a really good boy. And you are worthy of love. And that choice that you made today is not okay. And it doesn't align with the good person that you are. So let's look at why you made that choice and work through it together. I love you. And how do you be accountable to the kid you punched without shame collapsing? Because shame also can inadvertently almost make us a little bit self-centered, because we can't or don't want to look at anything that is suboptimal, because we make it mean. It's what we make it mean. We make it mean that we're bad or wrong or stupid or not good enough, which actually makes us less accountable or more self-abusive, depending on what our valid coping mechanism is.
So can you explain a bit more this piece that you just talked about, that kind of not looking at it with judgment, but looking at it more as information? Like what are some of the ways how people can, or like anybody listening can start to look at things more like information versus, or what's the role in shame into looking at whatever we did wrong with judgment versus just seeing it as information of something to reflect on and look for ways to improve on?
Well, that's a great question. And if I don't answer it to your satisfaction, let me know and we'll come at it again, because this is a beefy topic. And I'm sure that there are lots of other perspectives out there and lots of experts out there that could offer a lot of value and perspective to this. But from my perspective, one of the things that we can do, one of the first things, is practice self-compassion first, so that we're going into growth and self-help or eating our shit sandwiches or blind spot work with a lighter, curious energy and an already solid foundation of, I am worthy. It's okay to make mistakes. And I approve of myself. Or I at least have compassion for myself. And it's okay to make mistakes. And I often, when people are going into that, starting to look at those things, I invite them to consider that if you feel guilty about doing something, that's your emotional navigation system that we always talk about. That's your emotional navigation system telling you you've gone off course. You're a little off of your true north of the amazing, good, divine, spiritual, amazing being that you already are.
And I'm just thinking, so let's say with doing something not great, instead of approaching it, let's say there's two ways. You can approach it with judgment and beating yourself up, or you can look at it as information. What's the role between these two? I'm just thinking, where does shame fit into one versus the other? With judging, is it the shame that is causing or helping with that judging, or with information there's like lack of shame?
Shame and judgment, yes, that's a really, really important, fine but important line. Is I often say it's a fine but important line. So shame and judgment are close cousins, and they love to hang out together. So when there's a difference between, say, I really hurt that person. I'm a good person, and I wonder why I did that. And how can I acknowledge to that person that I impacted them without going into I'm so sorry, and making them forgive us, which is actually still sort of being a little bit self-centered. But that's something else we could talk about. Whereas judgment would look more like, I can't believe I did that. I'm so terrible. I'm such a terrible person. I can't believe I didn't hurt them. And then we're spending a lot of time and energy, again, beating ourselves up and creating more separation and less accountability and less compassion, which is very normal. So if you catch yourself doing that, celebrate the awareness. Don't beat yourself up for beating yourself up, because that's not helpful either. I've done that. That's definitely one of the patterns that I have delighted in overcoming most of the time, unless I catch myself. But it helps us be more accountable, more compassionate, to just approach things as information. And then with judgment, because on some levels of consciousness, it's more helpful to look at everybody as a good person who is currently experiencing, either a hostile takeover from one of their parts, or a cry for help, or a sign of trauma, or a protective mechanism of anger, or whatever. And the more compassionate we are to ourselves for these things, the more we're going to be compassionate to others, which I would like to make this fine but important line distinction. It does not mean we don't acknowledge abuse, assault, and suboptimal coping mechanisms and behavior. And it certainly doesn't mean that we tolerate abuse at all, because we love ourselves and have too much self-compassion to allow that. But it just means that we will spend less of our time in emotional reactivity, fear, judgment, separation, or the illusion of separation of humanity, than would be optimal as we're evolving out of the emotional dark ages. So looking at ourselves with curiosity and compassion when we behave poorly, and then stepping into accountability from a place of empowerment rather than a place of shame, is just more helpful, and is a skill, and might take time and might take a lot of failure until that becomes your new sort of baseline, or your new way of perceiving and behaving in reality.
And can you also explain what is shame collapsing? Because for me, I think it's the first time that I even heard that way of explaining it, or even like calling it, because internally it might make sense, but for somebody listening, it's like, what is it? Even like with shame, what's the difference between shame and shame collapsing, if there is any?
So shame collapsing, all of these things, let's remember that all of these things are just sounds that are coming out of a hole in our face. What they mean is subjective. So the way I define something might be different than the way somebody else defines something. So all we're trying to do together is find metaphorical alignment so that we can have a common language that allows us to more quickly diagnose and repair when something in our life is not working, so that we can accelerate ourselves into our most fun and magnetic lives. So there is no fact necessarily about any one of these concepts. So we're just going to find alignment. So shame collapsing is when, say for instance, I felt hurt by something my partner did, and I wanted to express my experience of what that felt like to me, or how I felt injured by that. And if I said something like, hey, it really hurt me when X, Y, or Z happened. If my partner were to make that mean that he was a bad person, and would just, it's sort of that shame collapse. We kind of go unconscious. It's like a flooding, overwhelming. It's a symptom of shame. And then we kind of go unconscious, and our protector personalities come out, or we just shut down and start beating ourselves up, which means we're not able to be present to others. We're not able to come into connection. Or some of our very valid but suboptimal coping mechanisms and protector personalities come in. Or I sometimes say it's like a hostile takeover. If you don't look at those parts of you that you judge, you don't give them a seat at the table of your consciousness and give them a chance to hold the talking stick and find out what their positive intention is for those behaviors. Or look at if they're just some nonsense programming you got when you're a kid. It's not who you are. If you're not looking at that and you're still judging and not willing to look at that part of yourself because you make it mean something, that part of you might do a hostile takeover of the talking stick from your subconscious. And all of a sudden you're like, you either start beating yourself up, you shut down, fight, flight, freeze. You might go into a trauma response depending on how much trauma. And you're like, I mean, everybody has some trauma in the emotional dark ages, but looking at what your trauma is. So a shame collapse is sort of just a symptom of not being able to look at something because you're making it mean, or your body is remembering an experience where you thought that you were bad or wrong or unworthy of love. Or could be, and that is different than a PTSD or a CPTSD sort of response. So there is a bit of a different flavor, at least the way I am describing those metaphors. Everything's a metaphor. So the way I am using those metaphors. So a shame collapse is just sort of when we get flooded by that feeling of like, it's like a flavor of embarrassment mixed with guilt, mixed with, you might feel it in your chest, you might feel it in your stomach, your ears might start to ring, your face might get hot. Everybody feels it differently, but it's like that feeling that a lot of people spend their entire lives making their decisions, impacting relationships, when we look at it with a slightly humorous lens, from trying to avoid that sensation in their body that we're calling shame, that is a reaction to a perception or a delusion or a distortion that we are bad or wrong, instead of looking at it as, that was not ideal behavior. I wonder why I did that. And again, look at, like, back to our example of the child. Our child punched somebody in the face at school. Suboptimal, but is that child still worthy of love? And are we just going to go, you're a bad boy, you must be punished, or it was that kid's fault, he made you do it? And when we're in that, we're not in alignment, and we're not in collaboration, we're not in connection, we're not in accountability, and we're not in compassion. So over time, we want to rewire our nervous systems and our brains and our behavior using these models so that we can become more accountable and compassionate without making it mean anything, and creating an inhospitable environment for shame and a foundation of compassion and curiosity.
And speaking on feeling emotions, let's say if there's anybody listening who might struggle or might not fully have clarity on how does shame feels like, or they're still navigating even like feeling the emotions or kind of distinguishing them, what are some of the things that they might identify outside of feeling the emotion that shame kind of requires to exist?
Like, what are the conditions that shame needs to thrive?
Yeah, for it to like exist, like what is it that they need to, or what's something that they can look outside of themselves that they can identify that whether they're doing, let's say, yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so shame kind of requires secrecy to exist, right? And shame sort of says, like, you're the only one who feels this way. Like, I have a lot of men who tell me a certain thing, like, hey, I like when somebody does this or that to me, and they're ashamed of it or whatever. They think they're the only one that feels that way. They're afraid to talk about it. So if you have a part of yourself or a vulnerability that you're hiding within yourself, it's creating this isolation. So it needs secrecy or isolation. And it needs a delusion or distortion that you are fundamentally not good enough, which is untrue, because you are a unique, one of a kind, limited edition expression of the universe, and you matter, or you wouldn't be here. There's no duplicates, there's no redundancies. We currently have a very hospitable environment for shame. And then there's also shame programming, I think accidentally, in some religions or some forms of teaching. And I think there's positive, helpful things and unhelpful things in any religion or any paradigm or any culture or any country. But historically, shame has been the norm. It's taught, don't be greedy, don't be this, don't be that, don't do this, don't do that. This is bad, that is bad, which is very different, which is not entirely untrue in some cases. But again, it's that fine but important line between you are bad or wrong and what are your most aligned actions. And some things that we've been shamed for in society, like our bodies or sex, sexuality. So let's look at certain organizations or belief systems where they teach you that sex is bad and wrong and dirty and shameful. Yet sex is a natural part of human desire and actually how life is born. It's beautiful and sacred. So if we feel that that is bad or wrong, but we have a desire for sex, so if men are told like, oh, you're being a pervert, or oh, your sexual desires are wrong, or you're such a horny whatever, and they start to feel, or they've grown up in a religion where they were like, sex is, you should, it's weakness, it's bad, it's wrong, then the part of themselves that feels sexual, they're going to shame and judge it and condemn it to the subconscious. And they're either going to start acting out because they're not getting that need met and developing very suboptimal coping mechanisms to get that need met, or they're going to deprive themselves of that need and say, I'm dirty, I am bad, I am wrong, I'm disgusting, and beat themselves up and create that internal separation or that absence of love and belonging that needs to exist within our multidimensional parts of self.
Interesting. And can you talk more on, or I'm curious to hear your thoughts on something that I found about the link between shame and addiction, depression, aggression, violence, bullying, suicide, eating disorders? Because I personally had never connected that with shame. And
yes.
Can you talk a bit more on what's the role of shame in these behaviors or these patterns?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we can get a little bit into it. I'm sure there's lots of experts out there who have a lot of really helpful perspectives to share on this. But from my perspective, as somebody who's done so much self-inquiry in my life from a very small age, I would just sit and for hours and hours and hours contemplate, why do I do this? Why do I do that? And as somebody who's experienced addiction, depression, anxiety, very unhealthy, toxic relationship patterns, both giving and receiving of, I can, and then just knowing all the clients that I work with all over the world, when we're out of that alignment of love and belonging and not getting our number one need met, and we believe that we are bad or wrong, that is literally opposite of what the humanity needs to thrive. And because we're confusing fitting in with love and belonging, we've just created an environment of shame and judgment. So one of the symptoms of that extreme pain is people finding coping mechanisms or outlets to try to cope with that pain, because that pain is supposed to be excruciating. That pain drives us back to connection, right? Loneliness is the number one most painful experience because it's the opposite of our number one need. And if we have loneliness from within those parts of ourselves that we deem as bad or wrong or gross or stupid or fat or too sexual or too stupid or too sensitive or too this or too that, or men are taught you have to be this, you have to be that. In order to be worthy of love, you have to be successful. You have to be brave. You can't be weak. You must be a provider. You must achieve. You must accomplish. You must not show this. You must do that. And again, we're trying to fit in. So then their vulnerable parts, their sexual parts, their whatever parts are experiencing that pain of separation from their own authentic alignment, which is why I tell people authentic alignment and vulnerability and authenticity should be one of the #1 goals of the human species right now. And learning to understand and accept each other, especially when we make mistakes, is going to create an inhospitable environment for shame, which means that a lot of those things that we're attacking the problems, we won't need to, because they'll just cease to exist, because we'll create an inhospitable environment for them. So if you see somebody in a lot of pain, addiction, aggression, they're symptoms of shame. Either somebody who's lashing out or somebody who's lashing in.
It's something
Even
that
I'm very fascinated by the set of symptoms that we refer to currently, probably a little too much in society right now, as narcissism. Narcissism itself, I think, is a shame disorder, right? It's having to create this manipulative way to get their needs met, feeling like nobody's going to look out for their emotional needs, and creating a coping mechanism of I am never bad or wrong. It's you're bad or wrong. It's like a severe coping mechanism for deep, deep shame. Same as people are like, oh, you shouldn't brag about yourself. You shouldn't, don't be humble, don't brag. But I actually think that celebrating ourselves is the antidote to the maladaptive or unhelpful version of I'm better than everybody else. And because then if they've learned that the only way they can be acceptable is by being the best, and they've accepted those rules in order to fit in, it's going to be so excruciatingly painful. So a lot of the most abusive, obnoxious, horrific, damaging coping mechanisms on the planet are symptoms of shame, as are the other side of that, the addictions, the wounding, the traumatized, there is other flavors of trauma too, and definitely, anybody should help find a professional who's in a trauma professional, or inform themselves about trauma so that they understand that layer as well, because that is an important layer that we're not talking about. But I like to look at all of that again as information about what's going on in that person's subconscious, and not judging it as bad or wrong. And again, that does not mean saying, oh, it's okay that you punched somebody in the face and that you're being a jerk to your wife. I'm not saying that, but I'm saying it's looking at everything with a lens of compassion of, you are a good person, you are worthy of love. Why have you had to develop this protection mechanism? And can we trace it to the shame that's behind it and heal the shame? Or can we just create that inhospitable environment for shame? And therefore, we don't need all of these coping mechanisms, shame collapses, abusers, self-abusers, or abusers of others, or blind spots, and all these ways that we've adapted in society to try to compensate for, or to try to avoid the pain of shame, or as a result of the pain of shame. So shame is the absence of authentic alignment, vulnerability, and authenticity is the catalyst for a lot of the pain on the planet. And it also impacts how we think. And most of our thoughts are nonsense thoughts. And we're going to do a whole episode on that, on the power of the mind and the power of the thought. Like, think about somebody can live their whole life either being extremely abusive to others or extremely abusive to themselves based on a thought. Because at the end of the day, shame is a thought. That's all it is. It's I'm not good enough. I am bad. I am wrong. Right? I'm not worthy of love. I'm not good enough. And that I'm not good enough, or I am bad, or I am not worthy of love can drive all of our behavior, even for decades. I remember the thought I remember the day I had the thought that was a result of a lot of experiences in childhood. And I have had a lot of trauma and a lot of ways that has come out in my life and provided me, well, it really what made me intrinsically incentivized to use my very capable mind to figure out what's wrong and how to fix it in humanity. But I remember the day I thought the thought that I am not worthy of love. I thought, why did my relationships keep not working? I remember thinking, well, I've tried this, I've tried that, I do this, I do that, it must be that I'm just unlovable. And I remember the day I thought the thought, I'm unlovable, that thought, my whole body felt like my cells were exploding. My ears started ringing, and my knees buckled, and I fell to the ground from the power of that thought. Is that thought true? No, not true. And then also the feeling of shame, a lot of people develop they're less adorable, more ridiculous, suboptimal behaviors and coping mechanisms to avoid the feeling of shame. Of like, what do you mean I'm not good enough? I failed because you did this. I got angry because you did that. If we think anger is bad or wrong and we get angry and somebody's like upset by our anger because we're not very good in society at holding space for anger, even though I think anger can be very helpful in the right situation and it's valid. But if we look at somebody, we're like, you got angry, you're bad or wrong. Like men often feel like they're scary if they're angry, and they can be, or they, it depends if it's in the helpful or unhelpful version of that. But if we start beating ourselves up or looking at that part of ourselves as bad or wrong, what we resist persists. That part's going to get bigger and bigger and more and more and more separate from us. And therefore, we're going to come further away from connection and compassion, authenticity, and authentic alignment. And our emotional navigation system is going to let us know of that by a sensation that is one of the most painful sensations in humanity that we will do anything to avoid, which is why I also remind people when we're doing some of this work moving forward is, hey, something might come up for you. You're safe. And remember that what is happening to you is a chemical sensation in your body. Not that I'm diminishing the impact of it, but it sort of helps my mind go, okay, I'm trying to avoid this feeling that's based on a distortion, which is actually bringing me out of accountability because I'm too busy. I'm like, I would rather, like the example I gave last week, when I had a conversation with a very conscious client who is very good at blind spot work, but very much identified as a good father, which he absolutely is. But when I said, let's challenge some ways that you're not a good father, that feeling of I'm not a good father. Oh my God, I might not be doing something good enough for my children, which means I'm not a good father, which means I'm a bad person, prevented him from looking at, hey, here's some ways that I'm kind of doing a bit of a shit job with my kids. And I might be impacting them, but I would rather impact them because people are like, I don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear it. I don't want to hear it because they don't want to feel that feeling. So you would rather impact other people than feel a sensation in your body that's going to last, I don't know, 15 seconds to maybe an hour. And then it's going to pass if you just allow it to pass through your body. And then you know where your wounds are and you can go heal the wounds. You can go to therapy, you can get a workshop, you can do whatever, you can find a trauma-informed coach, whatever you need to do. Read some books, find a support group. So really, this inability to feel and look at shame is also a real barrier to us connecting to our more evolved behaviors because it makes us unwilling to look at what we're doing wrong because we make it mean we are bad or wrong.
So with this, what if somebody's listening and thinking that there's so many negative things that shame is doing to us? Like, what's the purpose of it? Like, what's the purpose of shame if it's in a way affecting us potentially in so many bad ways? Is there like what would be the answer to the question of what's the purpose of shame? What is it there to do for us, not to us?
Whew. I'd be curious if anybody has more insight in the comments. I would like to acknowledge that nothing I say is absolute truth. I just offer my perspectives and experience. And I'm always open to new information. However, I would say that shame is more of a KPI that we're out of alignment as a species. I think shame is a symptom of a distortion or a delusion or a separation from the optimization of humanity as we evolve out of the emotional dark ages. But if we wanted to attach a positive spin to it, which I love to do without going too far into toxic positivity, but its positive spin is where the shame is, you know where your wounds are, you know where your blind spots are. Chase the shame. Yes, follow our joy, follow our bliss, follow our alignment, follow what makes us feel good, and let's be responsible by also following the things that we don't want to look at. And that's where reprogramming our brains to eat a shit sandwich, which again, I think is a little bit of a crass term, but I use it because it's kind of light and it makes it less like, do shadow work because you're a bad person. It's like, eat your shit sandwich. It doesn't taste good. You're fine. It's going to give you an unpleasant sensation. And then you're going to level up, because it actually takes bravery to look at what we're doing that's not optimal. And it's not our fault that we have all of these maladaptive coping mechanisms in society, but it is our responsibility to find a way out of it, not only for our future generations, but because that's how evolution works. We're healing out of the emotional dark ages. And I'll speak from experience. When you become more stress resilient and trigger proof and authentic, and you heal shame, your life is so much more fun. I can't even tell you how much more fun it is. And it wouldn't be helpful for me to tell you, which is why we're providing these blueprints so you can experience it for yourself. And then when it's also so helpful in relationships to understand how shame and these things show up, so that we come out of judgment and more into conscious conflict and figuring out how to use our reactions and our coping mechanisms as sort of roadmaps to where we have some work to do, or where our unintegrated parts are hiding in the subconscious, so that we can give them a seat at the table of our consciousness and start to get curious about what valid want, need, boundary, or value that they are trying to meet for us in unskillful ways. And again, it doesn't mean we're going to approve of our lousy, maladaptive, ridiculous, silly, or suboptimal behaviors, nor that of others. But again, it's going to help keep us out of this unconscious sort of continual binary dualistic, I am good, you are bad, I am right, you are wrong. You'll see this too in human relations, and I've definitely experienced it also, where if I did something suboptimal, I'd be like, well, it's because she said this and he did that, and they made me feel this or that, and they didn't understand my intention, and that's why I did that thing. Whereas if somebody else did it, I'd be like, oh, that person's bad. So we kind of like, excuse it in ourselves. Or the other extreme, which I've also been on the other end of that spectrum, where I'd be like, you're right, I'm the worst. I beat myself up. When I first started doing this really accountable work like Ho'oponopono, I'd be like, yes, if it exists with them, in them, it exists within me, but in sort of this, yeah, see, beating myself up sort of way, rather than I'm sure I would act exactly the same as you in your situation had I had the same trauma, the same experiences, the same, whatever is you. So it doesn't impact me as much, and I'm able to be more curious about them and try to figure out what is unhealed in them, or what they're trying to communicate, or why they're in a hostile takeover from one of their parts, which is like a cry for help, which just keeps me it keeps me more in connection and compassion, and less self-centered, really less fearful and self-centered, because when we're super in that trying to fit in, we actually become quite self-centered. And I realized that about myself, even some of my patterns of self-sacrifice or people pleasing, where I have a lot of compassion and love for those parts of myself, and I understand why they developed, and I know what they were trying to accomplish for me, but they did as sort of make me more self-centered, like most humans, because they're constantly trying to protect their self-concept rather than approaching things with curiosity and compassion.
Can you talk on inhospitable environment for shame? Because that's
Right.
something that I feel a lot of people listening might want to hear about.
Yeah. So when we're looking at shame, what we don't want to do is shame the shame, judge the shame, or be ashamed that we have shame, or try to get rid of the shame, because that shame is also a part of us, right? And the goal is love and belonging. So we want to bring all these parts in, and you, as the CEO or the leader of all of your parts, you want to give them a seat at the table, give them a seat at the boardroom, and be curious and inquire what need they are meeting, what their skills are, and mentor them or promote them into different coping mechanisms, like the inner worrier to an inner warrior, the inner critic to an inner coach. We want to manage or provide conscious leadership to those parts of ourselves. So creating an inhospitable environment for shame is more helpful. I think it's just a nicer energy to take action from behind, which is, again, practicing self-compassion, owning our awesome and owning our shit without making either of them mean anything, being curious, becoming skillful at feeling and processing and releasing emotions, and practicing the skill of vulnerability and being willing to let those parts of you find a safe place to be seen. So my clients do that with me, or with groups I facilitate each other, or with their partners. And sort of starting to look at those parts of yourself with a lot of self-compassion and curiosity, and coming out of that secrecy through vulnerability and authenticity over time just naturally creates an inhospitable environment for shame, and also helps us be less triggered by other people's behavior, and less in judgment and more in curiosity about why they're behaving that way. Because again, if we get mad at somebody and say something unskillful, we're like, well, yeah, of course I did, because they made me mad, or they made me this, instead of owning our own emotions. And then when somebody else does it, we're like, you're bad, you're scary, you're wrong. And I will say that many men share with me that the most shame, which they probably wouldn't initially give it that word when we work together, but the most of this pain occurs in their relations with the women that they're close to. Being told, like, you're lazy, you're not doing this, you're not a good dad, you're failing at this, you're not earning enough money, or when men do try to be vulnerable and show some of these emotions, it destabilizes the emotions of the woman, and she goes into an emotional reactive state, or they feel attacked, or she starts to feel unsafe because she wants him to be strong and tough all the time. And then there's a consequence. So it can just be, yeah, it can just be like, it can become just like a big shame soup with everybody.
And is there a way, because you said that creating that inhospitable environment, does that mean that there's a way to have shame go away or disappear, or kind of pretty much what you said, get rid of? But I'm just curious, with creating that environment, how big of a, let's say, reduction
Reward. Like,
of
what is the
shame does it give?
reward?
Yeah.
Yeah, over time. So like anything, learning is non-linear. So it's not going to be a one and done, or it might be. Like, we don't want to have an attachment either way to what that journey looks like. We don't want to say it's going to be a lifelong journey, because if we believe that, it'll be true. And we don't want to think that we're going to have it in one day. So we just want to be curious. We don't know what it's going to look like, but I promise you that challenging work is going to pay off in so much freedom and flow and fun and fulfillment and happiness. You have no idea. I promise you it'll be worth it to go through that journey. And yes, we could think of it, instead of shame going away, we could think of it as, you want to be an alchemist. You want to alchemize that shame into internal empowerment and permission to be vulnerable and authentic, and therefore an evolutionary leader modeling a different way for humanity, which requires a lot of bravery. And being vulnerable is one of the strongest, bravest things that an evolutionary leader of a man can do to help lead humanity out of the emotional dark ages and provide that hospitable environment for connection and collaboration and sacred relationships and security and safety.
Is there, I lost my thought, but is there anything else that you want to add when it comes to shame or dealing with shame or addressing shame or looking at, oh, actually, I remember. So with what you said about, I really like the way you put it, chase the shame, because I feel like it's something that naturally we don't want to chase it. We don't want to look at it or
Yeah,
specifically the way you said it, to chase it, because that
yeah,
in itself, I feel like, at least when you were saying it internally, I feel like it's kind of disempowering it
yeah.
to have power over me. It's, you kind of like taking the steering wheel in some ways.
Yes, you are. And you're chasing it, but then you're sitting with it. You're not self-abandoning. You're sitting with that part of yourself. And you're sitting with it like a child who would come home, who might come home and say, again, we'll use that really ridiculous example I used. Your kid punched somebody in the face at school and it comes home and the kid is like, and you've looked at it, you didn't say, my kid didn't do that. You didn't say, you little prick, you can't believe you're such a bad boy, you're punished. And you didn't go, oh, well, that kid probably deserved it. So we're not in any of our valid, normal coping mechanisms, but we're just looking at that. And if our child is like, I am such a bad person, I'm such a violent person, I'm such a this, such a that, you do want to correct that behavior, but first you want to presence them emotionally. So it's sitting with that part of yourself that feels shame, which can be very uncomfortable. So again, I encourage you to find a safe environment to be able to practice that. And remember that you will be safe and that it's an unpleasant sensation, a chemical reaction in your avatar and your nervous system. And you can breathe through it and presence it, and you can figure out what wound that was hiding, or you can just release it, or you can look at it and just say, okay, I did this. Not my favorite, it might have impacted others, and I'm really brave for looking at that, because most humans, especially men, struggle to look at that because they've had to create such a narrow self-concept in order to fit into the really unhelpful, unfair, abusive paradigms that we've all co-created to put humans into. But men, I think, might even have a little more of this, where they have a very narrow range of what they're allowed to be to fit in. And so I commend, if you're listening to this podcast, you are definitely an evolutionary leader, and you are definitely a thought leader and a game changer. And if you have had struggles in your life, or you've tried a lot of different self-help things, or if you're new to self-help, whatever you're coming to us with, it might be overwhelming to start. It might be hard, but you can do it. You will get better at it over time. And I'm telling you, the rewards for doing this, for chasing those things and healing them like an evolutionary warrior, is going to be so empowering and exciting, and it's going to provide such a safe environment for yourself, your family, your coworkers, your employees, your spouse, and also just your own ability to experience fulfillment and the fun of achieving and growing and creating from a place of empowerment, rather than a place of I'm not good enough, imposter syndrome, I have to do better, I have to be better, or else I'm not good enough. And you'll get more results in less time, with less effort, and way more fulfillment than when we're achieving and striving from shame. Perfectionism is also another coping mechanism for shame. Narcissism is a shame disorder. Perfectionism is a shame disorder. So if you're taught in childhood that you need to be the best, and you have to, you can achieve this or you can achieve that, or mom and dad, we put everything into making sure that you become a doctor or a lawyer, and don't let us down, and and you become, I am, your self-concept to fit in is I am what I perform and how well I perform it. And anything less than that means I'm not good enough. And that actually can drive a lot of achievement. So it's not that we look at that part of ourselves as useless. We look at it and say, thank you for helping me achieve so much. I am worthy of love regardless of what I achieve. And promoting that inner critic to an inner coach, promoting, looking at those parts of ourselves and creating different mechanisms for them to run different inputs and different outputs for them, so that we are sort of creating, again, from this place of magnetic masculinity and expansion and flow and abundance and self and vulnerability and self-compassion and authenticity. You are still going to be able to achieve, but you might achieve more, you might take less effort, and it's going to feel better. So yeah, shame's uncomfortable, but look at it, because it's really important that we all do it. And we kind of owe this to each other and humanity and the next generation, or the next generation we incarnate into. So do it for yourself if you have to, if you believe that you're coming back to this planet at some point in the future. Whatever you believe is valid, and it's always helpful to look at these things and find strategies and tools that work for you to help humanity heal out of the emotional dark ages and experience your most fun, fulfilling, magnetic life and delicious, exciting relationships.
I love it. All right, well, that's the episode on shame, packed with value as usual.
Yeah, please let us know if you have any questions or any helpful things that you would like to add. And yeah, thank you for listening. And if you want to book a strategy session with me to map out your personal magnetic masculinity blueprint, there will be a link in the show notes. You can do that. And I do recommend listening to this podcast series more than once, because every time we sort of change our level of consciousness or expand or become more aware, we get different layers of value out of certain information, and your subconscious will pick up what it needs to wherever you are right now. Stay patient and trust the journey. Repetition works, time works, and you cannot fail at healing. But you can fail at things in life, and you can make any failure evidence of effort and bravery. Don't make anything mean you're not good enough, because nothing means that.
I love it. Well, we will see you next week. And next week, we're talking about wants, needs, boundaries, and values.
Yes, how to align to your most selfish core wants, desires, needs, boundaries, and your ever changing, growing values. And when you know those things, it's much easier to assess your life and look at what areas are lining up with what's going to make you feel happy and fulfilled, and what things are looking for a little bit of change or optimization.
Yeah. All right. We will see you next week.
See you next week. Bye for now.